Hey everybody, happy Saturday. It's Brad, aka Shambazzle Games, with your D&D weekly news for Saturday, January 25th. Let's do it! Kicking it right off with community news. Not too much to say today, but I do want to let the community know that I will be taking a very short hiatus, a content hiatus, and it's for a very good reason. You might remember that a little while back over the holidays, before we kicked the door down on 2020, I mentioned that I had a lot of fairly lofty goals going into the holiday season, including focus on the website, shambazzlegames.com, getting a ton of editing done in preparation to launch our custom 5th edition, the heavily narrative-driven D&D actual play podcast called the Charisma Check Podcast, as well as some other odds and ends I wanted to tie off. You know, I've got some editing backlog to get to in my podcast catalog. And unfortunately, those ambitions were a little too broad for the holiday season. Apparently, my family had other plans. And of course, I had a wonderful time with them. I cherish and love them all. But I also cherish and love my Dungeons and Dragons. And it's time for me to make time to get back to those projects. So all that really sums up to say that next week I will be taking a bit of a content break. We're going to go somewhat quiet. My Twitter channels, I'll still be pumping out some daily D&D content there. And of course, sharing all the great things that we're going to discuss today in the news, including the D&D Daily News podcast at Speaking Common. But this time is going to allow me to finally tie off some loose ends with the website and get that up there so that I can have a digital space to publish all this content that I'm putting these efforts into, and a couple of podcast items that I really need to get squared off before they go too long. So that's it. Really keep an eye out for new things coming down the line in content for the community after next week. I'm going to take a little bit of a break, but I will be back hard at work here with you all in short order. Stay tuned. Lots of great discussion as always in the Twitter community at Shambazzle Games on Twitter. Make sure you follow me and get involved on everything that we share all day, every day with regards to the Dungeons and the Dragons. Let's start with villainous inspiration. I asked the community, what types of iconic or famous villains have you built your own big bads off of, or evil characters that you may have played? There are a lot of great options out there, of course, and I tend to go to the Star Wars universe. On that note, I noticed that a vast majority of the nerd culture t-shirts I own are Star Wars t-shirts, so I'm trying to switch it up a little bit today. But characters like Palpatine and Darth Vader, and even Anakin in his rise to or realization of the dark side of the Force, all have these really great nuanced backstories and elements and even powers and abilities that make them great fodder to draw from or leverage some inspiration when you're trying to create your own big bad evil creatures to taunt and torment your players. So when I'm building a villain, I really do go all the way into backstory, just like I was creating any kind of player or long-standing NPC for my campaigns. I start with where they began, right? What was their upbringing like? What were their parents like? Their social, culture, faith-based events that helped define what paths they took in their own lives. I really do believe that villains and NPCs in general are much more interesting when they act with what they believe to be the best interests or the best outcomes in mind. So I always take into account that idea that a villain is acting in a way that he or she believes will produce the best outcome overall, no matter what the cost. Then it just comes down to a question of morality. Now that's not always the case. Sometimes characters are just nuts because they're nuts, and that's fine too. But make sure that you balance it out unless you're running some kooky pandemonium, complete and utter chaos scenario, which is, you know, your call. But think about the backstory and particularly those defining moments that opened the gate for them to make the choices that they made. When I'm thinking about a villainous big bad, I always think about that cultural perspective. I think about how they were awakened to or introduced to the power and abilities that allow them to mobilize these evil or villainous machinations that are going to ultimately impact the character world and playing environment to drive the intent for your players to want to stop them for whatever reason they might have. Then I go into their objectives and goals, and this is where it really starts to drill down into something that you can use in your campaigns. Very simply put, think about what your villain wants, what they're willing to do to get there, and how they go about achieving those goals. And that instantly becomes your North Star for directing how that villain's going to act and react in a very organic and honest way in your game world. Next up, we talked a little bit about reaction, and I asked, what do you typically use your reaction for? Probably one of the most popular responses I got was forgetting about my reaction, so that prompted me to bring it into the newscast this week and talk a little bit about how the action economy actually works and what you want to keep in mind as combat is starting to progress around the table. Last week, we talked a little bit about always having a plan B in mind. So just a quick recap on that. As a player, when you're in combat, you always want to have an idea of what you want to do when your turn comes around, but always have a plan B in the pocket just in case the circumstances around your plan A change in an unforeseen way that force you in a position to react. Now, to segue from that, when we talk about the action economy, right? You have your movement, you have your action, you have a bonus action, and every character has a reaction per turn. That doesn't include the fifth unspoken element, which is your free action or little, let's say, narrative inclusions that don't necessarily take an action, reaction, bonus action, or movement to play out. So every character has an action, the most common action in combat being attack. It can be pull a lever, it might be a skill check. Typically taking a potion also costs an action as far as the rules are concerned. A lot of people house rule around that one, so check with your game master, of course. But reaction is something to keep in mind as well. And if you don't have an ability that specifically gives you a reaction, well, you've heard of holding your action. Holding your action actually uses your reaction to execute something specific with a trigger in mind. So if you say, I'm going to draw an arrow, aim it at the door, and as soon as that door opens, I'm going to fire, and that is your held action, well, that actually uses your reaction as far as the rules are concerned. Of course, disclaimer underneath, blah, 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 blah. But it's a great way to put reaction into play if you're not sure what you want to do when your action comes around. You don't want to hold up the table too. Otherwise, I typically would shy against, leveraging an action, which is extremely valuable, to turn it into a reaction because that doesn't really give you the best return value on what you can do in that moment. Now, as your character progresses, of course, you're going to get reactions that become available to you. Certain spells, certain abilities, and feats will allow you to do that. But always keep those reactions in mind. And if you need to, start a little sub-list on the side of your character sheet. Just call it reactions and list them out there where you usually look when you're in combat, like around your attacks table or your items and weapons table. There you go, reactions. Don't forget them. They're important. And maybe your DM might even let you use your reaction to do something a little bit more nuanced, like calling out a command or fumbling through your pack for something to help you when your next turn comes around. But play with it. Just don't leave them by the wayside, because otherwise you're not really playing with the full action economy. Movement, action, bonus action, and reaction, and free action. So then we looked at some of the most disliked classes of Dungeons & Dragons, and there was actually quite a mix across the board for this. A lot of people weren't really crazy about monks because they felt like they were lackluster, or they preferred a previous version of monks. Barbarian actually got mentioned a lot more than I would have expected. Not a lot of love out there for barbs. Maybe these are indicators that these classes need some pizzazz for a lot of people. One that did come up pretty frequently was Ranger, and I get that because the 5e Player's Handbook, let's say canon edition of Ranger, is a little bit flimsy in my opinion. Ranger's the only class through the whole suite of classes available to D&D PCs that I actually encourage use of the unofficial Unearthed Arcana version. And the reason is mainly around how the environment angle of Rangers play out in UA. So with the 5th edition version of the Ranger that's shipped with the core Player's Handbook, their environmental practices and awarenesses are pretty limited. They have to choose a specific character to be their favorite enemy, and that really funnels a player into making a choice. Particularly when a new campaign sets off, you might not have an idea of whether or not that choice is going to be useful to you until you start the game. I always encourage either way to have that conversation with your dungeon master or GM to make sure that the choices that you're making are going to be beneficial to you as you play the game. Because you don't want to get 5 levels into a character and realize that, well, this is kind of gimped. I don't really get the benefit of that, and by proxy, I'm not really enjoying playing it, and that's something we all want to avoid. But the revised Ranger class from Unearthed Arcana, it's available on the Dungeons & Dragons Unearthed Arcana site. It's actually really good. It doesn't offer anything that threatens to throw the balance of your game out of whack, and it gives the Ranger much more broad options like choosing humanoids or beasts as a favored enemy, choosing a biome or a more broad environment as their favored terrain so that they get those bonuses more frequently. There is nothing worse than making a choice as a player for your character, getting 2 or 3 sessions in and then suddenly realizing that it's not working out the way you had planned, or worse, that you just don't feel like you can compete with the other players at the table. And I think as game masters, it's really up to us to help protect that good experience by offering those options. For that reason exactly, I always offer my player a complete do-over up to level 5. So from levels 1 to 4, I allow my characters to change anything they want about their characters, including a complete redo of their characters, provided they talk to me about it first and we understand where the problems lie, so we don't just recreate them in a new character. But once they hit level 5 and they make those updates to the character sheet, training wheels are off and you're locked in. Finally, I have 2 really great partnerships might be a strong word, but definitely some collaborative opportunities with some community members. As you know, I don't really shout, tweet, include, or promote anything that I don't or wouldn't use myself. So these 2 items are actually going to become really important parts of how I prepare and produce campaign materials for my Dungeons & Dragons games. One of them is fellow DM, author, content producer, and DMs Guild published creator named Andrew Kaywood from the West Coast of Canada. Just launched the Kickstarter to help produce the 3rd in his series of monsters books. They win all kinds of awards. The community's crazy about them. I know that this work is going to be great, but the reason it hit my radar is because this new book is Monsters of the City, and I'm actually going into a phase where I'm building out the next story arc for Charisma Check, which actually takes the characters into a alternate version of a city they're familiar with, which is inhabited with lots of hostiles. So I'm hoping that I can draw some inspiration from the 3rd in the Monster series from Kaywood Publishing, called Monsters of the City. Now, there's only a teaser available right now, and of course we've got some great art behind it too, but the Kickstarter is up live. It's almost completely funded, so now's the time to get in there. It's going to be locked in. It's going to come out just like everything else that they produce. So highly encourage you to check it out. Link in the show notes, of course. Or you can wait and I will have some kind of review on it. And I'll do another little video that goes a little bit deeper into the specifics of what's available in that preview this week. Now, the final is one that I'm super pumped about. As you know, map making is a big part of the content that I want to produce on this channel. It's where I got my start in, my bedroom so long ago with an overhanging light, just drawing maps out on 34 by 22 inch graph paper. We've come a long way since then, and if you follow my content, you'll see my new table setup that has a nice flat screen LED monitor that I serve my maps to. So that's been great for a short time, but I always wanted to get into digital animated map making. So after reaching out to a couple of very high profile players in the community, I'm happy to say that I am working closely with the Arkenforge team to learn their tools. So Arkenforge is an extremely dedicated, passionate group of 4 designers and developers who are just doing amazing work in this. They're so passionate about the project. There's lots of content out there and videos to help me get oriented and make the decision to choose this platform, at least out of the gate. And then I just jumped in for the trial version, which is free. That link is in the notes underneath too. So if you are interested in map making or digital map making, particularly with animations, definitely check it out. Jump on the Discord. The team is extremely responsive. I've been directly in contact with, I think, all of the developers involved in the project now. They're extremely generous with their time and totally passionate about the project. So that's the type of thing that I choose to get behind when I can. And of course, a huge shout out and thanks to the Arkenforge team for introducing me to the Masters Toolkit, which is their app-based software. This thing is incredible. I'm going to have a lot of tutorial videos and introductory videos coming out this week, but effectively it's not just a digital cartographer with animations, tiles, and completely customizable map making options. It also includes an encyclopedia, a scenario builder. It's your one-stop kitchen sink solve all for the dungeon master that's looking to digitize your operation. It's got quest notes, character notes, NPC notes, anything you could want to keep your game on track. And I'm really looking forward to diving further in it with you for the remainder of the next week. Okay, that's a wrap on community and Twitter news around the verse. Let's get into, you know it, it's my favorite part, DM and player tips coming up. I was delighted to get back to my regular schedule of 3 Dungeon Master tips and 2 player tips every week this week, starting with DM tip number 1, don't neglect downtime. Give your PCs a month, a couple of weeks of rest in-game, and let them flesh out what their characters want to do and how they want to evolve outside the script, let's say, or away from the table. I've done this in a number of different ways. I've facilitated it through Facebook Messenger with each one of my players, and we've played out the scenario in text. They've talked to me a little bit about what they wanted to do, what they wanted to achieve, or what objectives they wanted to conquer based on the amount of time that I was giving them. And sometimes it was a week, sometimes it was a couple of months. So we'd go back and forth and come to an agreement on what they could accomplish in that time. It's tremendous for character development. It lets you satisfy some needs that maybe characters didn't have fulfilled in the last story arc, and I usually bring this in between every major story arc. Of course, throughout gameplay, they're going to have lots of opportunity to visit cities, interact with NPCs, and do things like this, but this type of downtime lets them identify a project they want to work on that might take a month, that would be really kind of clunky and frankly boring to play out at the table. So don't neglect downtime. Find a way to play that scenario, even if you take it away from the table. I'm sure your characters will love it. And be sure to jump on Twitter, follow me at ShamBasilGames, and talk to me about how you're managing downtime in your games. The second DM tip, and kind of a close cousin to that, is to keep a log of what's happening outside of the campaign environment. I always say my worlds are living and breathing, and they happen in real time. So if the characters move away from Objective A and start to follow another storyline, well, the world still happens for Objective A and the cities, people, and social environments involved in those pockets. So keep a log of what's happening outside of there. When I'm running a campaign, I've got my session notes on what's happening in the world where the players are currently focused. And then I also have a side log with all the other things they've encountered and engaged with. And I update that every session as well. So session to session, things are happening in these 6 or 7 other arcs while the players are focused on the primary arc, let's say. This helps inspire organic effects on the future of the PC. So when they come back to those objectives, they will be evolved. Things will be changed. Maybe the same people aren't around. Maybe more people are involved. Maybe the political landscape has changed and now they have to readjust. Maybe a town has been ravaged while they've been away. Maybe some of their favorite NPCs have gone missing. Possibilities are endless there when you really treat it like a living, breathing world behind the scenes, as well as what's in focus in the spotlight today. Now, the third and one of my favorite DM tips this week is intended for those of you who might be having trouble delivering succinct descriptions at the table. I really like to be as descriptive as possible as a DM, and honestly, my challenge to work on is not to provide too much exposition to the point where I'm kind of rambling about the environment. My players are like, okay, let me just do stuff now. So I always try to keep it nice, short, and sweet, but that can be difficult to do when you're in the moment and you've got, 100 other things going on as a game master. So to check yourself, always think about the 5 senses, right? Your hearing, sight, smell, taste, and touch. How do things sound in the environment? What do they look like in the environment? What can you feel? And feel is a bit of a tough one, but it might be a tactile sensation, a tiled wall slick with stale water, or a rough hedge that is thorny and threatens the proximity along a bank. Things like that can contribute to feel. Or it could be just a chill in the air as a brisk wind blows through the shaft of a long forgotten tunnel. How things taste? Well, hopefully they're tasting things that are meant to be tasted. You can always lick a wall, I guess, and describe that if you want. But, let's be honest, that could totally happen. So think about the 5 senses. And then, of course, the 6th for D&D specifically, furniture. Describe how the room is finished. So let's just run that off the top of the head. You step into a common room, which has long been forgotten. You see billowing cobwebs that sway and flow as a brisk breeze cools the air around you. You also see the still embers of a fire that has long since gone out, but not so far in the past that heat doesn't still emanate from its burning coals. The only scent in the air is the stale musk of adventurers whose stories have never been told and a general sense of eerie silence permeates the entire environment. Play with it, and the more you use this tactic, the better you'll get at it, the faster you'll be at delivering accurate and succinct descriptive descriptions. That's redundant. Maybe it will help with your podcast and videos too. I don't know. All right, jumping into player tips. This is a player tip that kind of helps the DM, but it helps all the players at the table too. When you're using a spell or ability that's going to require or trigger a save, let your DM know or GM know as soon as you cast or action that ability what the save is, and specifically what DC they need to beat. You know your DC, of course it's yours. It's the only one you have to remember. But GMs, amongst, like I said, the 100 things that we have going through our heads, we often have trouble keeping track of what everyone's DC is all the time, or armor class, or anything specific like that to your character. So when you're doing something that's going to require your DM to save or throw against your DC, give them the effect, but also give them the DC to just keep things moving. It'll help us out a lot too. The second player tip and the final tip for this week is about engagements and encountering in combat. Why wait for a battle to end to interrogate a foe? The example I used is when you're locked in sword battle or sword play with an enemy, nothing's stopping you from saying, who sent you, or who do you work for, or where are the trucks going? I don't know. Just be creative, but speaking and issuing short commands like that are a free action. They don't play into your action economy, like we mentioned earlier, and they really add a lot of color to the engagement that's happening around combat, so you're not just rolling dice, hack, slash, and wait for your turn to come around. Add narrative to the combat around the table. Talk to your comrades. See if you can call out orders. That guy's got a knife. I don't know. Or that one's not paying attention. Shoot him in the face. I don't know. But add some narrative around the table and communicate with your comrades, because that's what happens on the battlefield. There's often a lot of shouting. People don't sit around a battlefield and anything that I've seen just quietly waiting for their turn to act. So hopefully with these tips and tricks in mind, you can bring them into your game this week. Do let me know if you use them, or if you have tips and tricks of your own. I'm always happy to share those out. And if you give me a DM tip or a player tip and I use it in my feed, then I'll definitely shout you out on my Twitter feed too. So we'll see you in the verse. With that, let's get into D&D news for the week. We're starting out D&D news this week with Larian Games and the upcoming release of Baldur's Gate 3, the very long-awaited sequel that is set to satisfy at least a majority of RPG gamers and Dungeons & Dragons aficionados the world over. So we don't really know a lot about the game at all. Of course, it was just announced at E3 in the Google Stadia presser back in June of 2019. But we have started to learn a few things over time as the studio has leaked or eked out details to the community at large. So we have no pricing or release date, but we do know that it's from Larian Studios, which is the studio behind probably what's being heralded as one of the greatest RPGs of our generation, with the Divinity Original Sin series, specifically Divinity Original Sin 2. So Larian built both of these and all of the addendums in the Divinity catalog, which scored 90s across the board for a lot of very honest and objective critics that I place a lot of trust in, like Polygon, Metacritic, Destructoid, and even Game Informer. All loved it with 95s, 97s, and basically 90 plus. So that'll tell you a little bit about the type of quality that we've come to expect as RPG gamers from Larian Studios. And obviously we hope or expect that to be carried through into this new iteration of the Baldur's Gate series. So two of the most important things that we have are a couple of videos that were released. Video number one I'm going to look at is a video where Larian Studios founder Sven Vink is standing before a boardroom and they're shouting at each other, and he's donning this plate mail armor and he holds above his head an iron flask and says, "I have the secret sauce for D&D." So obviously I was very interested to know what Larian Studios thinks the secret sauce for D&D is. Bound to polarize as everything, but Hold up, it's coming. The video then clips to a shot of Sven and his colleague Gigi entering the Dungeons & Dragons corporate offices in Seattle, where they're met by the receptionist. And from there, they go into perusing the various nostalgia and sculptures and knickknacks that are there from the Dungeons & Dragons world. The receptionist, of course, tells them to not touch anything because they're not allowed to play with that. But not before Sven identifies the Iron Flask, which is an iconic magical item from the 5th edition DMG, which has the power to trap a creature. That's important later. So Gigi, of course, forms this brilliant distraction as Sven pockets the flask, and they go into their meeting with none other than Dungeons & Dragons creative director Mike Mearls. And of course, they make a tongue-in-cheek reference to the fact that people have been trying to license Baldur's Gate 3 forever. To be specific, Baldur's Gate 2 was released in the year 2000, so it's been 2 decades that fans have been waiting for this coming edition of Baldur's Gate 3, or someone worthy enough to create the damn thing. So from here, the video actually goes into a pretty informative piece about how Larian Studios won the licensing to create the game in association with Wizards of the Coast on a few key pillars that I'm taking as promises from the studio. And those are, it has to be a big, grand adventure. There's no small potato steaks at the table here for Baldur's Gate 3. It has to be true to Dungeons & Dragons lore. Of course, something that's so entrenched in the rich history of Faerun has to follow and deliver on that lore that fans expect and are so intrinsically invested in. Of course, player agency is key, and if you're familiar with the Divinity Original Sin and Divinity Original Sin 2, you'll know that there are mechanically lots of ways to do pretty much anything you want or behave in any way you want. So player agency is obviously important, as it is with our tabletop game. And then, of course, they have pretty high stakes and high expectations from both the owners of the IP and Larian as a very well-established AAA publisher. So the stakes are really high and the delivery has to be high to match. Now, Mike Mearls makes a joke about specifically making sure that seromorphosis is part of the process. And seromorphosis is the process whereby mind flayers actually replicate. So they infest humanoids with worms and, let's say, symbiotes that ultimately take over the humanoid's body and eventually transform them into a mind flayer. That's how they assimilate races. And from here, there are plenty of mentions or nods to mind flayers, or illithid as they're called in the lore, and as it relates to this game of Baldur's Gate 3. We now know, of course, from the teaser trailers that mind flayers clearly play a pivotal role in this new arc. But it was interesting to see them kind of point to it as, the knickknacks on the shelf. One of them's a mind flayer. Mike Mearls takes them on a tour of the offices where they showcase the big illithid, the mind flayer head that's mounted that you may have seen on Critical Role. And now, of course, the actual intentional message that seromorphosis also has to be part of the campaign direction. On that note, it ends with a really great little tour where they walk around the Dungeons & Dragons office in Seattle, so it's worth watching for that alone, even if you want to see kind of what goes on behind the walls. And invariably, Sven takes advantage of a distracted Mike Mearls to knock him out and entrap him in the Iron Flask. I'm not going to go into whether or not I think Mike Mearls is the secret sauce behind Dungeons & Dragons, so then it glides into a little bit more of a documentary-style stand and deliver where Sven and team are delivering some of the expectations that they actually do see coming into production for Baldur's Gate. They talk about regular progress videos coming out over their channels, new features and components that they're building into the game. So this is how they're going to release that material and information to the public as the game continues on its development path. He has said that it is the biggest and best RPG that Larian Studios has ever made, and they're doing so in super close collaboration with Wizards of the Coast. So hopefully that will be truly collaborative, and I'm going to inject my own opinion here. I really do hope that Wizards can trust the years of experience and the accolades that Larian has established for itself as a premium provider and developer of narrative-based role-playing games. They're going to do a fantastic job. I hope they'll be allowed to do the great job they know they can. It's a grand adventure filled with things to explore and experiment with, NPCs, challenging combat, memorable characters, and tough decisions, of course, that if it's anything like Divinity, are irrevocable and have a tangible, lasting impact on the game world and the story you're going to experience. They also alluded that you can either play with a party or solo or multiplayer, and I imagine that this will probably follow suit as the Divinity series too. Video 2 that I looked at in greater detail was, of course, the recently released teaser trailer that shows us a lot more of the CGI version of what the game's going to be like. The teaser trailer for Baldur's Gate 3 shows in the beginning a weary knight who's clearly battered and bruised as he's stumbling through the ruined streets of Baldur's Gate. This knight is a member of the Flaming Fist. We can see that because he has the Flaming Fist emblem emblazoned on his chest. And the Flaming Fist is a mercenary company, one of two factions that provides security and peace inside the walls of Baldur's Gate, the other being the Watch. So immediately this character falls to his knees and begins the process of seramorphosis. From there, he goes into the painstakingly and clearly traumatic process of an accelerated transformation into a mind flayer. He rises as a completely transformed Illithid, begins to float from the ground and towards the camera in a very presumptuous and aggressive manner. Now, it's worth noting that in the background of that video, we see what looks to be some kind of colossal floating tentacled object in the sky, slightly obscured by some of the buildings. But if you look closely, it almost represents what some might say is the Stranger Things-esque version of the Mind Flayer that they call it. And all these humanoid shadows and shapes floating up into the sky. This actually has place in Illithid or Mind Flayer lore, and given that they have revealed that the Illithid or the Mind Flayers have rekindled or rediscovered the secret behind the nautiloids, I'm going to go ahead with the assumption that that's what we see in the background. And back when the Mind Flayers first came to Faerun on their astral travels, nautiloids were these big mothership type entities that they used to capture, harvest, and convert humanoids and other creatures into mind flayers. And that looks exactly like what's happening in the background here. So I'm willing to bet that that's going to feature into the story for Baldur's Gate 3. So let's take a look at a little bit of background around Baldur's Gate itself to understand what else we might expect from the story of Baldur's Gate 3. First of all, Baldur's Gate is hailed by many as the real capital of Faerun, certainly the trade capital. It hugs the Sword Coast, right at the cusp of the River Kyanthar and the Sea of Swords, which makes it premium territory for ships coming and going all along the west coast of Faerun, from the jungles of Chult, the Moonshea Isles, other big capital cities, including Waterdeep along the coast. It's also surrounded by mountain ranges, so it's very protected from both the elements and siege on most of its fronts. Now, the existence of the River Kyanthar and knowing that that is the conduit through which Baldur's Gate conducts trade to the rest of Faerun, it's presumable that this could actually open up the game well into the Western Heartlands and into other areas of familiar territory in the Forgotten Realms. Now, as we know through the release of Descent into Avernus and some of Baldur's Gate's more narrative history, there has always been a rich sense of darkness and a history of evil that underlies daily life in Baldur's Gate, through the coming of Baal to the demonic ingress from the powers of the Nine Hells through Descent of Avernus, left only to the salvation of those two factions I mentioned earlier, the Flaming Fists, which is the mercenary company that holds stead over some of the lower districts of Baldur's Gate, and the Watch, which are the more formal peacekeeping ranks of Baldur's Gate security. So here's some speculation based on my understanding of both the lore and the announcements that we have around Baldur's Gate 3 from Larian Studios. Like I said, it was released at Google Stadia Presser in June as part of their E3 activities. It's confirmed for Stadia and PC, but I'm really hoping that we're going to see this on console as well. I don't think there's any reason not to do it there. It is based on the 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons rule set. This has also been confirmed, but of course a very trimmed down version that's designed to work well in a video game format, which of course has different stipulations and structures that need to be understood. The seramorphosis that we see in the trailer, in the words of Sven himself, is an accelerated version of seramorphosis, and it doesn't typically play out this way. So presumably between this reconnection of the Mind Flayers to their former power and glory with the inception of the Nautiloid, and this transformation that we see happen very rapidly suggests that there might be a new evolution of this that is threatening Baldur's Gate and, by proxy, the entirety of Faerun. Mike Mearls also confirmed that Descent into Avernus, the previously released campaign for 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, is a prequel to this iteration of Baldur's Gate 3. So while the impact that your tabletop games have might not necessarily impact the video game version, lore-wise, there is a sequential flow there. Larian Studios has made quite clear that the release date will be quote-unquote when it's ready, which I actually find promising and refreshing in today's hurried, hustled publishing and development environment for video games. And they've made quite clear that they're not willing to compromise the vision or the integrity of the game to meet a published date. That's really not represented enough in the world of games today. So if you are familiar with the Divinity series from Larian Studios, then you probably also want to know whether and if Dungeon Master mode will be included. DM mode was a really great alternate way to use the game that allowed DMs to actually create and craft playable scenarios. And I know a number of game masters who've actually brought it into their table games as a virtual environment to bring their players into. So, I mean, it's Dungeons and Dragons. It's called Dungeon Master mode. I can't see any iteration of this that's not released with DM mode enabled for Baldur's Gate 3. And finally, I do have faith that because this IP and the Baldur's Gate franchise specifically is so protected, it's such a valuable asset for Wizards that it's really going to get the white glove treatment every step of the way. And Larian Studios is exactly the right developer to make this a reality. Now, the most recent video that we saw from the studio came out through their Twitter account just last week, showing some motion caption, showing some image capture and generation, and at the end, the date of February 27th, 2020. Clearly not a release date. I don't want to get anyone, in a frenzy about that, but presumably some kind of information reveal or update is coming on February 27th, 2020, and large enough so that they made a video teaser about it. So I'm really excited to see what Larian and Wizards is coming out with in regards to Baldur's Gate 3 at the end of the month. All right, if you are a streamer or a D&D content creator of any kind, particularly in the live streaming format, this information is at some point going to be valuable to you, I'm sure. It was announced this week that Wizards of the Coast has entered into a partnership with Streamelements to produce a platform for Magic the Gathering streamers under their influencer marketing platform called SECAP, which stands for Streamelements Creator Activation Platform. Now, this will very likely ultimately have implication for D&D content creators and streamers as well. But right now, Wizards of the Coast is specifically focused on Magic the Gathering streamers or influencers for this project. So what is it? Well, this further capitalizes on the popularity and the impact that live streaming has had on Wizards' business across MTG and D&D. And it's a platform designed to bring together streamers or influencers and brands that want to access them for business. So first of all, Streamelements is a platform implementation like Streamlabs or Streamelements that allows streamers to put in place powerful app and widget-based engagements like overlays, chatbots, giveaways, stream alerts and follower alerts, bit donation management, all that stuff that goes behind the business of why streamers stream. It's officially an integration platform for live streams. Now, the content activation platform is designed to connect streamers and influencers with those brands that are looking to do things like create endorsements, placements, sponsorship, even ad run on those channels. And it comes with a number of benefits for streamers, including achievement-like objectives, a menu of things that they can accomplish to earn sway or clout and increase their visibility for these brands, as well as earn things like game codes and, of course, visibility to access those brands. So some of the stream incentives that they offer that are achievement-like could be things like, stream for a particular amount of time or stream during specific time windows, stream a particular tutorial or how-to on a piece of a brand's content like MTG, build a particular sample, or in the case of MTG, play with a particular deck or strategy, and other more broad options that are community-based, like host a community play stream and involve your followers, or rate another channel with a particular number of viewers. And of course, then the payout for streamers and their communities are exclusive giveaways, game codes and samples, and other things that you can use to inspire more involved engagement from your communities, because let's be honest, from a marketing perspective, that's extremely valuable for brands to be able to tap into the authenticity and the genuine voice that comes from those communities. So on that note, obviously there are clear benefits for brands as well, and those include, like I said, one-stop access to niche product-focused streamers and influencers and their engaged communities, as well as share in that community building, vetted, verified streamers that are sourced and monitored by the platform itself. And of course, in order to even participate in the program, they have to have a history of good practice and honesty. It allows for a shared handling of these influencer and streamer relationships between Streamelements and the brands they represent. And to use Streamelements' own words, it's an end-to-end solution for live streaming and influencer marketing, which is a really interesting frontier in marketing and advertising that's playing out in the modern scenario. So this new partnership in the platform is available to MTG streamers right now. You can sign up for the beta at streamelements.com. And like I said, I truly believe that this is also coming at some point for D&D content streamers as well. Clearly, Wizards is dialed into the benefit that live streaming on Twitch, YouTube, Facebook, and Mixer and other streaming platforms has for its brand, and the success in this growing resurgence for Dungeons and Dragons. So it is absolutely natural, and I think more or less a guarantee that this is going to come down the line for D&D streamers too. So if you're in that space, or you're looking to find a way to make it more financially viable, or if you're looking at getting into that space, I'd recommend seeing if you can maybe not sign up unless you're MTG as well, but at least stay tuned to this, because it's going to have a significant impact, hopefully for the positive, and how you turn your love of D&D into a little side hustle or a full-time business. In other Dungeons & Dragons news this week, Critical Role's Explorer's Guide to Wildemount putting up some really respectable numbers. That really shouldn't surprise anybody. We saw what happened with the Kickstarter. Around the new compendium that's officially being released between Wizards and Matt Mercer's Critical Role. So we got some early numbers around those pre-orders, which really piqued my interest because Wizards is historically very tight-lipped around statistics, metrics, and KPIs around their products and programs. But nonetheless, last week, Greg Tito was speaking a little bit about the early successes that they've enjoyed since the announcement of Wildemount. Specifically that, as we can see ourselves, it hit Amazon's bestseller book list, not just for an RPG, not just for a tabletop game, for all books available on the platform. So rocketing to the top of the bestseller list last week was Critical Role and Wizards of the Coast's Explorer's Guide to Wildemount, officially making it the best-selling official Dungeons & Dragons source book since the launch of the 5th edition Player's Handbook. That's pretty significant. And in case you missed it, we did a full and thorough deep dive into all things we know about Wildemount in a complete details review on last week's cast, so check it out. Click there probably. And we talked a lot about the lore, the factions that are at play. We talked about the 4 adventures that are going to be included and the subclass options, as well as a deep dive on Matt Mercer's Dunamancy magic mechanics, the maps, monsters, the gazetteer, as much stuff as we could get our hands on we delivered. So go ahead and click, or come back and click, and check that out too. On that note, if you're enjoying the news and you're listening from your car or from work or doing household chores, be sure to check us out at dndnews.libsyn.com. And I'd love for you to throw me a subscribe if you're enjoying the podcast, and even better if you can toss me a 5-star review on iTunes to help us spread the word and grow the podcast. I really love doing this, and my intention is just to share it as much as possible. Or if you're watching the video cast, do hit the subscribe button and show me your support on YouTube. I'll never force product or ads down your throat. I'm only here to deliver the news and great D&D experiences. And of course, follow me at Shambazla Games on Twitter for all daily D&D news, content, conversation that drives a lot of this content that I produce week to week. So I really do hope to see you there. But I digress. Moving on into other D&D updates. Let's talk about this new D&D movie and what came out this week. We know we're getting a new Dungeons & Dragons feature film in the year 2021, We also know that film is obviously a collaboration between Daddy Hasbro, who owns Wizards of the Coast and by proxy D&D, and Paramount Pictures, who is producing that film. There was also some talk about who was going to direct, script, and adapt this piece, but that's what's been actually confirmed this week. Unequivocally, Jonathan Goldstein and Jonathan Francis Daly, the dynamic duo that brought us Game Night and Spider-Man Homecoming, absolutely confirmed to be writing the script and creating and directing the film. That features a few things we covered a little while back too. We know that the plot is centered around the search for a powerful legacy artifact, which we now know revolves around the Archlich turned god Vecna. We also know it's going to include iconic heroes and heroic characters like Palarin Dusk, the Gold Dragon. No other word really on how it's going to be cast or who's going to be put in some of the pole positions for the movie, but it's still really interesting. I do have hopes for it. My fingers are tightly crossed, but it sounds like they're taking the time in doing it right. Of course, the conversations of this started around 2015. It just seems like they're having a trouble getting all the adults to agree on a scheduled night to focus on Dungeons and Dragons. Don't know what that's like. But as always, we'll keep an eye out for updates on the movie and see how it goes. I hope it does well. I think it would be cool, but, I'm curbing my enthusiasm to stay objective, for the news. Rounding out the news this week, we learned that DC Comics is actually releasing a D&D 5e sourcebook. It's based on the sci-fantasy setting that DC released a little while ago, actually, called The Last God. And The Last God, DC seems to be trying to diversify its batfolio of comic and fantasy offerings and taking a swing at tabletop this time. So from what we know, DC is releasing a comprehensive 40-page sourcebook that's said to include everything that you need to begin a campaign in this new world or adventure setting, and using the experience with the 5e rule set to platform this new campaign. Now, obviously, as a business, it seems like they're looking to leverage this new resurgence in the popularity of D&D to help bring about some creative awareness for what they're doing and push the brand itself into this new audience. I feel like we've seen that somewhere before, maybe even recently, but I'm drawing a blank on it. In any case, it's been listed as a one-shot adventure at the list price of $4.99 US. And honestly, for that price point and the 40-page item, it sounds to me like it's going to play out more like a supplement or an addendum or, just kind of something that's aimed mainly to drum up interest for the existing piece, which is the comic series The Last God. But if you're interested in it, when it releases, it's supposed to be available at comic book retailers, and they've said select or participating digital retailers. So I don't know if that means it's going to be available on D&D Beyond or DM's Guild or Drive-Thru RPG, but presumably one or all of those outlets will make this new piece available from DC. At least it's not like, a straight ad shtick. I mean, DC Comics has narrative clout, and it might actually be pretty good. There certainly were a lot of fans, it seems, for The Last God, the comic series, and it seemed like a really cool concept too. So we know that the source book is going to be called The Last God, Tales from the Book of Ages, and it's based on the Last God series that was written by Philip Kennedy Johnson with art by Riccardo Federici. And it begins decades after a world-defining victory over and the defeat of a malignant god and their hordes of undead armies. And in this case, segments of or parts of that horde have started to resurface in the world, and that's where we hand it over to you, the player, to determine what happens next in this new saga. So the world of The Last God is called Cain Anun, and the compendium for 5e is set to release on April 29th, 2020. As for some of my personal opinions or impressions as I'm reading through this, like I said, given the size and the price point, I think it's really going to play out more like a supplement. So I don't know if calling it a 5e source book or an official or a 5e compendium is really justified more than kind of hypey. So I would look at this more like a compendium or supplement to manage our own expectations. But in that, for the price of $5, I think it might be worthwhile even just seeing if you can pull some content from it for your own game or use it as inspiration in the worlds that you're building and playing through today. So for that alone, I think might be worth the $5 if the content's good and the art promises to be really nice from what I've seen. So if you like it enough after that, then it's a great gateway to check out the published comic series titled The Last God. And I think that's exactly what they want, is for this to be an entry mechanism to introduce people to the comic series. And if it works, it works. Great. Then everybody wins, right? You got content you like and I don't know, the DC sells stuff. All right, finally rounding up the Dungeons & Dragons news this week in a piece released from Inverse, which I'm really enjoying. If you're ever listening to this or if you're anyone from Inverse, the new editorial platform looks amazing and the content is great. This week they released a piece that focused on 25 celebrities who not only love to play Dungeons & Dragons, but talk about how D&D has actually impacted their lives. So I definitely encourage you to check out the piece at inverse.com, linked down below, of course, and in the show notes for the podcast. But we know there are some celebrity names that keep popping up in the world of Dungeons & Dragons. Joe Manganiello, Deborah Ann Wall, Steve Colbert, Vin Diesel. But what I really was interested in this piece are some of the ones that I was less familiar with. So to name a couple in the angle of the article, Jon Favreau was talking about how it inspired or helped him trigger helped him tap into imagination and imaginative storytelling and helped him learn how to create tone and balance. And of course, we know where Jon Favreau went, both on the acting and directing side of the screen. Another one was Greg Grunberg, who was recently a featured cameo in the last 2 Star Wars films, more so in Rise of Skywalker. But you might know him better from his hero's persona as telepath Matt Parkman. So you recognize him if you see him, but he credits his beginnings as an actor to playing Dungeons & Dragons. And actually, Matt has a Twitch live stream at Socialtron Live, if you want to check him out too, where he and some buds play tabletop games primarily. So that's always interesting to me when celebrities are doing this great work, but they're also playing on the same streaming platforms that we create content for every day. Third one that I found really interesting was Joseph Gordon-Levitt, who, of course, from lots of places, but most notoriously in my history, Third Rock from the Sun. That might be dating myself, but it is what it is. And he credits his involvement in Dungeons & Dragons and Magic as his inspiration for creating the collaborative media content platform Hit Record, which is a really great kind of upstream for video content creators too. Of course, all the other wonderful things that Joseph Gordon-Levitt has done in his broad and long career as a performer. So that got me thinking about a lot of the conversations that I've had with community interviews on Speaking Common and just casual conversations I've had with friends of mine as we grow through our lives with this game and into our careers. And it got me thinking about the impact that it's had on my life. I began playing Dungeons & Dragons back in the 80s with 1st and 2nd edition or AD&D Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. And it was really that. I was brought in by a friend whose brother played, and his brother ran us through a little campaign. We actually walk around his house with our little graph paper and map out the dungeon that suspiciously mirrored his second floor. But from there, I really started to play more regularly, and I spent a lot of summers with great friends and meeting new friends. And from there, I started to read the books, and I got really heavily involved in this descriptive narrative. And in hindsight, that has definitely had a tremendous impact on where I am as a professional and as a creative marketer. It's affected how I present and how I build presentations and pitches and how I bring storytelling into my craft as well. There are times when I find myself in a boardroom and I'll lay something out on the table figuratively, and I'll look back on it and say, yeah, that was definitely a D&D thing. Or I'll even use language and vernacular that comes from my experience running campaigns at the table. Most frequently, what I use is the ability to think on my feet, react in a moment, retain information, and be able to recall it later in a way that is strictly improvisational. And to think that at one point they literally thought the devil was doing this to people. Anyway, hit me up on Twitter at ShamBasilGames because I truly love to hear genuinely how D&D has helped impact, shape, or benefit or change your lives. And with that, we've got a wrap on your Dungeons and Dragons news from all around the world on this Saturday, January 25th. As mentioned, I'm going to be taking the next week off. Well, not really off. I'm going to be focusing on getting legs under the website at shambazelgames.com. I'm going to be focusing on getting at least the first 5 episodes of Charisma Check, our narrative-driven custom 5e D&D campaign, up so that we can start releasing that to you. I'm so excited to share that story. It really is a labor of love. We're so proud of it, and I think it's freaking awesome. And of course, catching up on all the podcast materials like I owe the community and the people who put their time into those podcasts too. So we'll see you on the other side of next week. Checkmates. Until then, happy gaming. Be good to one another. And we'll see you on the Twitters at Shambazel Games. Peace.